In 1845, a mysterious fungus swept across the fields of Ireland. Within weeks, the potato plants that millions of people depended on for survival turned black and rotted in the ground. The smell of decay hung over entire counties. Families who had eaten nothing but potatoes for generations suddenly had nothing at all. Over the next 7 years, roughly 1 million people starved to death. And another million fled the country on overcrowded ships, many of them dying at sea before they ever reached land. It was one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 19th century, and at the center of all of it was a single crop, a lumpy dirt-covered root vegetable that most of Europe had refused to eat just 100 years earlier. That was ATT 45. But the story of the potato starts thousands of years before any European ever laid eyes on one. The Andes Mountains, roughly 8,000 years ago, high above the cloud line in what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants grew scattered across the rocky, wind-swept soil at altitudes above 12,000 feet. These were not the golden, starchy potatoes you would recognize today. They were small, some no bigger than a walnut. They were bitter, and they were genuinely toxic. The wild potato produces solanine and tometine, glycoalkaloid compounds that cause nausea, vomiting, cramps, and in severe cases, death. Eating these things raw was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The indigenous peoples living in these mountains had figured that out the hard way over many generations. But they had also figured out something else, something that would set the course for the next 8,000 years of human agriculture. They discovered that if you soaked these wild tubers in cold mountain streams for days, the running water would leach out some of the toxicants. If you then exposed the soaked potatoes to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at high altitude, where nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below zero, you could break down the remaining harmful compounds and make them safe to eat. It was a painstaking, multi-day process that required patience, experimentation, and an intimate understanding of chemistry that these ancient farmers would never have described in those terms. But it worked, and over thousands of years, through careful selection of the least bitter tubers and replanting of the mildest specimens generation after generation, Andean farmers slowly bred the poison out and the starch in. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway. By the time the Inca Empire rose to dominance across Western South America around the 1400s, the potato had become something extraordinary. Inca farmers, working the terraced agricultural fields carved into the steep mountain slopes around Cusco and throughout the highland provinces, cultivated more than 3,000 distinct varieties. Some were bright yellow, some were deep purple, some were red, white, or blue. So dark they looked almost black. They came in shapes ranging from perfectly smooth and round to gnarled, twisted, and lumpy, in ways that would have terrified a modern grocery shopper. Each variety was suited to a specific altitude, a specific soil type, a specific microclimate. The Inca did not just grow potatoes. They had built an entire agricultural science around them, and through that science, they had built a civilization. And they solved a problem that would stump European farmers for centuries after them. Storage, fresh, test, potatoes rot. In a world without refrigeration, that is a serious problem. But the Inca technique for making chuño was brilliant in its simplicity. Farmers would spread freshly harvested potatoes across flat ground at high altitude and let them freeze solid overnight in the bitter Andean cold. The next morning, as the intense equatorial sun warmed the mountainside, families would walk over the frozen tubers barefoot, squeezing out the moisture with their feet. They repeated this cycle of freezing and stomping for several days, until what remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry block that weighed almost nothing. Chuño could be stored for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, or more without spoiling. It was arguably the first processed food in human history, and it was a logistical miracle. It fed Inca armies on long military campaigns across the Andes. It sustained entire cities during lean harvest years. It was so central to Inca life that the Inca measured time, partly by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes, and they measured distance partly by how much chuño a traveler needed to carry between 2 points. This was not just a crop. It was the foundation of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas. But the people who would eventually introduce the potato to the rest of the world had absolutely no appreciation for any of this. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were looking for gold and silver. They found both in staggering quantities. What they barely noticed, and certainly did not value, was the ugly little tuber that the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators did bring a few potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula sometime around 1570, but nobody was particularly excited about it. There were no celebrations, no royal proclamations. Potatoes were given to sailors on long voyages as cheap provisions to prevent scurvy, and they were donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown, which was busy counting Inca gold, had absolutely no interest in promoting a food that came from people they considered savages. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When the potato finally reached the rest of Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror. And you have to understand the context to see why. Europeans at this time grew wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were grains, noble crops. They grew above the ground in the sunlight, reaching toward the heavens. Bread made from grain was considered a gift from God. Entire economies, entire feudal systems, entire civilizations were organized around grain cultivation. The potato, on the other hand, grew underground, in the dirt, in the dark. It was lumpy, misshapen, and covered in strange little growths that people called eyes. Worse still, it belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade, which is one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To many Europeans living in deeply religious, superstitious societies, this was not a botanical coincidence. It was a warning from God himself. The rumors about potatoes spread faster than the crop itself ever could. In parts of France, the potato was formally blamed for causing leprosy. The Parliament of Besançon actually banned potato cultivation in 1596 on the grounds that it spread the disease. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin against God. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed potatoes caused flatulence, uncontrollable desire, scrofula, which is a form of tuberculosis that causes grotesque swelling in the neck, and general moral corruption. Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible, and therefore the crop could not possibly be intended by God for human consumption. And no, that is not something anyone made up. That was a real theological argument made by real clergymen in real churches. For nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe, the potato sat in gardens mostly as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant. Its delicate purple and white flowers were considered quite attractive. Marie Antoinette reportedly wore potato blossoms in her hair at French court events. Botanical gardens in cities like London, Seville, and Vienna displayed potato plants alongside other exotic specimens from the New World. Scholars wrote papers debating whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous. But actually eating the thing on a regular basis, that was beneath the dignity of any respectable European. Potatoes were animal feed at best and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest laborers considered it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. The class associations were unmistakable. Bread was civilized. Potatoes were not. For a while, the potato seemed stuck in this humiliating position, a rejected, misunderstood crop growing in the margins of European agriculture, while millions of people went hungry around it. That did not last. War changed it. Famine changed it. And a handful of stubborn, slightly eccentric leaders changed it. The first major turning point came in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick Takot, known to history as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia from 740 to 1786, and he had a very specific problem. His country kept getting dragged into devastating wars with neighboring powers, and during these wars, enemy armies would burn Prussian wheat fields to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy. You just set fire to it and watched it burn. But a crop that grew underground, completely hidden beneath the soil, an invading army could march right over a potato field without ever knowing that dinner was 6 in below their boots. Frederick saw the military potential immediately. In 1756, Frederick issued the Kartoffelbefehl, which translates roughly to the potato order. He commanded Prussian peasants to plant potatoes or face the possibility of having their ears and noses cut off. The peasants, predictably, were not enthusiastic. They thought potatoes were disgusting, fit only for livestock. According to one widely repeated account, villagers in the town of Kolberg sent a message to the king saying that potatoes had neither smell nor taste and that not even dogs would eat them. Frederick was not amused. But he was clever. According to legend, Frederick tried a different approach entirely. Instead of threatening his subjects, he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around the perimeter to guard it. The message was obvious without being spoken. If the king himself needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves, which, according to the story, was exactly what Frederick had intended all along. Whether every detail of this legend is historically accurate remains debated among scholars, but the result is beyond dispute. Within a single generation, the potato had become a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Meanwhile, across the border in France, a man named Antoine Augustin Parmentier was fighting a similar battle with even more flair. Parmentier had been a pharmacist serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War, and he had been captured by Prussian forces and held as a prisoner of war for 3 years. During his imprisonment, the primary food his Prussian captors gave him was potatoes. Day after day, meal after meal, Parmentier ate potatoes. He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he came out of captivity in surprisingly decent health, better than many soldiers who had been eating the standard French military diet. This made Parmentier think very hard about everything his own country believed about the potato. After returning to France, Parmentier dedicated the next several decades of his life to a singular mission. He would convince the French people to eat potatoes if it was the last thing he ever did. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society, where every single course from appetizer to dessert was made from potatoes. He presented potato blossoms to King Louis XVI, who reportedly tucked one into his buttonhole and wore it around the palace. He convinced Queen Marie Antoinette to wear them in her hair during court events, turning the potato flower into a fashion accessory. And then, he pulled a version of the same stunt Frederick had used. He planted a large potato field in sandy, infertile soil of the Sablons plain outside Paris, posted armed guards during daylight hours to make the field look important, and then conveniently pulled the guards away every night, so that curious Parisians would come steal the plants. Parmentier was essentially running a one-man public relations campaign for the potato decades before the concept of public relations even existed. And it worked. By the late 1700s, France had finally begun to accept the potato as human food. Today, the French still honor Parmentier. The classic dish hachis Parmentier, which is essentially a French version of shepherd's pie, bears his name. There is a Paris metro station named after him, a boulevard, a hospital. The man gave his life to a root vegetable, and France gave his name back to history. But while France and Prussia were slowly warming to the potato through clever marketing and royal endorsements, something very different and far more dangerous was happening across the English Channel on the island of Ireland. And this is where the story of the potato takes its darkest turn. Ireland, in the 1700s, was under British rule, and the vast majority of Irish land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, who often lived in England and never set foot on the estates they controlled. Irish Catholic peasants, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, were tenant farmers working tiny plots on land they did not own and could be evicted from at any time. British policies like the penal laws had systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, what they could buy, what professions they could enter, and how much land they could rent. Families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of increasingly marginal, rocky, boggy soil. Many families survived on plots of just 1 or 2 acres. The potato was perfect for this brutal situation, almost as if it had been designed for it. 1 acre of potatoes could produce enough food to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close. The potato grew in poor soil where grain would fail. It grew in the wet, cool Irish climate that made wheat and barley unreliable. It required almost no equipment or investment to plant or harvest. You did not need a plow, a horse, or a mill. You needed a spade, some seed potatoes, and enough rain, which Ireland never lacked. A family could survive on potatoes and buttermilk and almost nothing else. And the nutritional balance of that diet was actually reasonably complete. Potatoes provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, and even some protein. Add buttermilk for calcium and fat, and you had a diet that could sustain life indefinitely. And sustain it did. Ireland's population exploded from roughly 3 million people in 1700 to over 8 million by 1840. The potato made that astonishing growth possible, but there was a catastrophic flaw built into this dependency, and anyone who understood agriculture could see it coming. Nearly all of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety called the Irish lumper. Farmers did not grow multiple types. They grew one. This meant that every potato field, in every county, in the entire country, was genetically identical to every other potato field. If a disease could kill one plant, it could kill every plant in Ireland, simultaneously. There was no genetic diversity to fall back on, no resistant variety waiting in reserve, and absolutely no plan B. The entire food supply of an entire nation rested on one genetic line of one crop, planted in one way, harvested at one time. The clock was already ticking. Ireland just could not hear it yet. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas docked at a European port. Hidden within those potatoes were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived in the exact cool, wet conditions that defined the Irish climate. The blight spread across Belgium and the Netherlands first, destroying potato crops as it went. Then it crossed to England, and then it hit Ireland. The effect was almost instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Potato plants that had looked perfectly healthy in the morning were black, wilted, and rotting by evening. Farmers would walk into their fields and find that entire acres of green, thriving plants had collapsed overnight into stinking blackened mush. When they dug up the tubers, hoping to salvage something, they found that the potatoes themselves had already turned to foul-smelling pulp beneath the soil. The stench of decaying potatoes became so overwhelming in parts of Western Ireland, in counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, that people tied rags and cloths over their noses and mouths just to breathe. The first year was devastating, but what turned a bad harvest into an apocalypse was that the blight came back. It returned in 1806, worse than before, and again in 1807, and again in 1808. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground. Families who had no other source of food began dying in their homes, on the roadsides, in the ditches beside the fields where their crops had failed. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through the weakened, malnourished population. Entire villages in the west of Ireland were depopulated, workhouses built to hold a few hundred people, crammed in thousands, and mass graves filled behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died of starvation and the diseases that followed it. Another million emigrated, many of them on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings, and their bodies were thrown overboard. Ireland's population dropped by roughly 25% in less than a decade, and the country never recovered that number. Even today, nearly 180 years later, the population of Ireland is still lower than it was before the famine struck. The British government's response to the crisis made everything worse. While Irish families starved, Ireland continued to export grain, butter, livestock, and other food to England under armed military escort. Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and attached to degrading conditions. Starving men had to perform hard labor, building roads that led nowhere in exchange for wages too small to buy the food that was rapidly becoming unaffordable. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as the judgment of God on a morally inferior people, and argued that providing too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. He wrote those words in official government correspondence, not in private. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by political indifference and deliberate policy choices. If the potato had lifted Ireland up, the blight brought it crashing down in the most horrific way imaginable, and the consequences rippled far beyond the island itself. The million Irish immigrants who fled the famine did not simply disappear into the world. They reshaped it. Massive waves of Irish immigrants poured into the cities of the eastern United States, into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they faced discrimination, poverty, and anti-Catholic hostility, but also where they built communities, labor movements, and political machines that would reshape American politics for the next century and a half. Irish immigrants settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto. They carried with them a deep generational anger toward the British government that would fuel Irish nationalist movements for decades to come, and eventually contribute to Irish independence in 1922. The Great Famine did not just empty Ireland. It planted Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the English-speaking world. And the reverberations of that scattering are still visible today. But here is the strange and unexpected part of this story. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, it proved beyond any doubt just how indispensable the crop had become. The lesson the world took from Ireland was not that potatoes were too risky to grow. The lesson was that it should never stake everything on a single genetic variety. Grow more types. Breed for resistance. Diversify. Plant breeders in Europe and the Americas began developing new potato varieties with resistance to Phytophthora infestans. Agricultural scientists established seed potato programs to ensure genetic diversity. The disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of scientific potato farming. And that is exactly what happened in the decades that followed. Russia had actually been fighting its own potato battles long before the Irish famine. Catherine the Great had tried to promote potato cultivation in the 1760s, ordering seeds distributed to provincial governors across the empire. But Russian peasants resisted violently. In the 1840s, forced potato planting campaigns triggered what historians call the potato riots, where entire villages rose up against government officials who were trying to make them grow the crop. Peasants burned potato fields and attacked the bureaucrats who planted them. Despite this resistance, the government eventually won out. By the 1850s and 60s, a combination of government pressure, agricultural reform, and simple hunger finally broke through the opposition. Within a few decades, Russian peasants were growing potatoes as a core staple alongside bread. By the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the largest potato producers in the world, and rural communities had given the potato a revealing new nickname. They called it the second bread. In China, European traders and Christian missionaries had introduced the potato during the 17th century, but it remained a minor curiosity for a long time. That changed when Chinese farmers in the mountainous interior provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou discovered that potatoes could thrive at altitudes and in soils where rice paddies and wheat fields were impossible. The potato filled a gap that no other crop could. By the mid-20th century, China had become the largest potato producer on Earth, and by the 21st century, the country was growing over 90 million metric tons per year, more than any other nation. India followed a parallel trajectory. British colonial officials had introduced the potato to the Indian subcontinent in the late 1700s, but it took decades for the crop to spread beyond small experimental plots. Once Indian farmers adopted it, production grew rapidly. Today, India is the second largest potato producer on the planet, and the crop feeds hundreds of millions of people across the subcontinent. The potato has become so embedded in Indian cuisine that many people forget it is not native to the region at all. Across Africa, the potato arrived later, but spread with surprising speed. Countries in the East African highlands, places like Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, adopted potato cultivation during the 20th century and discovered that the crop performed exceptionally well in their cool highland climates. The United Nations and the Food and Agriculture Organization have called the potato one of the most important tools for fighting hunger and malnutrition in the developing world, and multiple African nations have launched dedicated national potato programs to increase production and improve food security. Globally, the potato is now the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons of potatoes are produced every single year across more than 150 countries. The sheer scale of what we do with potatoes today would stun an Inca farmer. French fries, which likely originated in Belgium or France sometime in the late 1700s, are now a multi-billion-dollar global industry, and arguably the most popular cooked food on Earth. Americans alone eat roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person per year, most of that in the form of fries. The potato chip, which legend says was invented in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, who sliced potatoes paper thin and fried them crispy to spite a difficult customer, has become its own enormous industry. The average American consumes about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 70 pounds of potato chips every year. McDonald's alone uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually just for their fries, sourcing from farms across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. But potatoes are far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Potato starch is used in manufacturing to make paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the most consumed spirits on earth, has been traditionally produced from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists figured out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires when natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off by Japanese forces. Potato derivatives show up in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and even the adhesive on the back of postage stamps. The potato, it turns out, is not just feeding the world. It is holding parts of the industrial world together. And in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin successfully cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle, Columbia, as part of research into future, long-duration space missions. If humanity ever establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or Mars, agricultural scientists believe the potato will almost certainly be among the very first crops planted. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It requires relatively little water compared to rice. It stores well in harsh conditions. It provides a broad range of essential nutrients. The same qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago make it the leading candidate for feeding human beings on another planet. Think about that for a second. A crop that the Spanish considered beneath their notice, that the French officially blamed for leprosy, that the Russians called the devil's fruit, and that Scottish clergymen refused to eat because it was not mentioned in the Bible, is now the leading candidate for the first food humans will grow on Mars. The potato started as a small, poisonous weed clinging to rocky slopes above the clouds in South America. Indigenous farmers spent millennia transforming it into something extraordinary. The Inca built an empire on top of it. The Spanish ignored it. Europe feared and despised it. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist dragged it into acceptance against enormous resistance. It fed the explosive growth of Ireland, and when it failed, it killed and displaced millions, reshaping the entire demographic map of the Atlantic world. It survived its worst catastrophe and went on to become one of the most important crops in human history, grown on every inhabited continent, and soon, possibly, beyond this planet entirely. Not bad for a lumpy root vegetable that nobody wanted. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of the potato's history surprised you the most, and make sure to like this video so more people can find it.